This time around for the Urban Explorer, we're going to look at the inner west, starting from our first slide, which is, and we'll talk about a few things that are happening over there at the moment that are relatively new, and we'll also talk about some of the interesting things that are happening over there that have been from the past. We're looking at, this is our little general statement of what we're doing, we're looking at the nooks and crannies of Melbourne that we drive past every day and we don't really notice what they are. And so this is my idea, is to talk about these things and bring some of their history out in the open, and also some of the things that are happening now too. Okay, next please. I think that last time we had the slide up on our first one, we had showed this slide, but this is where we're starting out from our new one. That's the Pink Lake at Westgate Park. And the Pink Lake requires El Nino conditions for it to go pink, because there's algae in the bottom and the salinity level has to build up over a dry period before it'll turn pink. The Westgate Bridge there, it was opened in 1978 and has opened up the west to everybody, rather than having to go right round through the northern suburbs to across the bridge at Maribyrnong to get round to the western suburbs. Okay, next one, thanks. Now there's actually four, well 3.5 new bridges going in right at the moment over the Maribyrnong River. And these are the first bridges that have been built over the Maribyrnong River for about 50 years. The four bridges you can see there, the nearest one is the current Footscray Road Bridge, which is being widened, and next to it you can see the red lines through there where the bike path is going, a dual carriageway for both pedestrians and bikes. They're building an incredible bike path that will go from the western suburbs right into Melbourne, and it's elevated most of the way across through docks, so it doesn't interfere with truck vehicles around the docks. The second bridge there is purely for access from the second from the bottom, is access for trucks leaving the dock area and going on into the tunnel. The tunnel entrance can be seen up here. And that track there is the trucks come out from the tunnel down there, and the fourth bridge over is from the docks, so they will come up and meet and go straight into the tunnel. And the Footscray Road traffic is that raised one through the middle. So it's quite an exercise. The bridges all of them are now partially built. So don't think about sailing a yacht up the Maribyrnong anymore. And the clearances are quite low on a couple of the bridges. There'll still be enough for us to get our type of wooden boats up there, but they are lower than the bridge further, the old bridge was. Next one, please. Okay. They're constructing from the end of Footscray Road, a road that runs around the back of the rail yards. They first proposed this road in 1890, mid-1890s, and they started in 1965. They built the first stage of it, which was what we know as Footscray Road. But it's taken 150 years for them to build the bit across the end around the back of the dock, which is Wurundjeri Way, and linking that across to Footscray Road, which is being built also at the moment. That's why Wurundjeri Way is shut at the moment, because they're building that connection onto the new raised road and onto the freeways. But some of these things take them a long time. For example, the current railway line that they're building under Swanston Street that runs up to Melbourne University and then comes out not very far from where the tunnel is, in this area in Docklands up here, just off to the right-hand side. That was originally proposed in about the 1860s, 1870s, and they're now getting around to building it. It's only taken them, a couple of hundred years to do that. Sorry, 150 years, I'm exaggerating. But the town planners back then were pretty clever. They did make room for some of these roads, unlike the town planners of today, well, not so much today, but of maybe 30 years ago, who sold off a lot of the road reserves because they didn't have any money, and now they're having to buy a lot of them back at huge amounts of money, but that's probably getting a bit political. Okay, next one please. Right, the first area over in the western suburbs we're visiting is Yarraville. Now Yarraville's a really interesting little place. I don't know whether many of you have been to Yarraville recently, but Yarraville was the first planned subdivision in Australia, and it was built around the Yarraville railway station, which was on Australia's second railway line, and that was the Williamstown line. And Williamstown, of course, at that time was our major port, and because the Victoria Dock hadn't been built and the Yarra was too shallow. So they built it to bring the cargo up from the wharves, but they also mined basalt down there. They mined the basalt, some of it was used for building blocks at places like Pentridge Jail, and other parts of the basalt, or other sections of the basalt, were used for ballasting ships, because all the ships coming out to Australia at that time were bringing stuff from the UK and Europe out to Australia, and there was virtually nothing going back because the agricultural industry really hadn't been established at the time in that era. It was starting to be established, but really was feeding the colony rather than exporting anything much other than some small quantities of wool in the 1850s. So when Yarraville Station was built, they needed a suburb for the workers that were working in the quarries, quarrying the basalt. And the basalt quarries ran from the river near the end of Stony Creek there, and all round that Williamstown and Yarraville and those inner suburbs around that area were all on the basalt plain, and they were quarrying basalt there. Why? Because it was close to the river, close to the ports for basalt, for ballast rather. So they built a station, and then around the station they built a property development, and that was occupied by workers. A lot of miners came out from the northern UK that were working in the quarries, from Yorkshire and Durham and those sort of areas, and they settled in these working man's cottages that were built around Yarraville Station. There wasn't even a road into Melbourne at that time, there was only the railway line. The railway bridge had been built over the Maribyrnong, but the road bridge hadn't. Now, Yarraville's now been yuppified. It's become a very trendy area to live. The houses, a lot of little cottages are being restored, and it's a nice place to live close to the CBD. Next one, thanks. Now, down in Yarraville, there's a place called the Sun Theatre. Now, the Sun Theatre was built in the 1930s, like a lot of these theatres, when film was very big in its heyday in the 30s and 40s, and every suburb had one or two theatres. I think Yarraville had 4 of them at one stage, but it fell into disuse in the 1980s, and by the end of that era, about 20 years later, a resourceful local named Mike Smith bought the theatre, but cheaply, and him and his wife set about restoring it. And Mike had other business interests, but one of his business interests was making theatre curtains of all things, and he was using at one stage, using the back of the theatre to manufacture theatre curtains for theatres right throughout the world. He's also a wooden boat nut, and when I first met him, he had about 4 large wooden boats, all moored in Victoria Harbour. He was also a member of the syndicate that owned Sayonara, the large 80-foot yacht that's been restored down there at Royals. But he had a Fair Mile, amongst other big wooden boats, a 115-foot Fair Mile. He had quite a few boats at one stage. But then he got into restoring the theatre, and that took up his time. And once he got that up and running and was doing quite nicely out of it, he decided he was getting a bit bored. So if we move on to the next slide. He made this decision that he decided he wanted to fly around the world, as you do. Now, being a bit of a go-getter, this Mike, he went and learnt to fly. He didn't know how to fly, but he only got a visual pilot's licence, the sort of light pilot's licence that a first-time pilot gets. But that wasn't going to stop him. He worked out that he could fly around the world in daylight if he had a seaplane, because he had landed on the water wherever he was, not in the ocean obviously, but he planned to go to ports and things. He could land in ports where there was somewhere to land that was calm, and he could pull up and anchor somewhere. He had an anchor in the boat, and he would go around the world. And so he did, and that's what he did. He made it round there okay. He got to he was originally only going to fly to the UK, and then he changed his mind and decided he would keep going, and went across the Atlantic and across the US and around the Pacific. But he had to go around the Pacific Rim because he had to stop all the way regularly to both refuel and to fly during the daytime, because he wasn't allowed to fly at night at all. So anyway, he managed to achieve that, got round and survived. Next slide. There's a few, I don't know what's in the water down at Williamstown, but there's a few interesting things that happen down that part of the world. The marina down there, which you've all passed many times, is owned by a guy, or the Anchorage Marina, was owned and still is by the O'Hare family. But Terry, I think, has passed on, but his son is involved in selling boats down at Williamstown, and I think the family still own the marina. I'm not sure about that. But he was sort of sitting down one day scratching his head and decided that he wanted to have a crack at the land speed record, as you do. And so he built a car. At that time, it was not long after the land speed record was set by Donald Campbell's Bluebird on Lake Eyre. And they started building their car with a jet engine in the back, and thought that Campbell had gone for total overkill in the design and everything, and they could do it a lot simpler. And he had a mate who was a jet pilot, and between the two of them they came up with that design, and they built it. The only trouble was they were about to head off there. They got the whole thing finished. They ran some test runs down at Calder on the Great Drag Strip, and it started to rain at Lake Eyre. And it hadn't rained at Lake Eyre for about the last 50 years, and Lake Eyre South flooded. Lake Eyre North used to get rain occasionally and get water in it, but very rarely did Lake Eyre South. But Lake Eyre South, which is where Campbell did his run, it flooded, and they couldn't do it. So they sort of sat on their hands a little bit. They ran it a couple of times at drag strips and things for a bit of fun. And they were about to head off, and they'd gone up to 270 kilometres an hour on the drag strip. It would move quite quickly. They were about to head off to Lake Eyre when it was starting to dry out, and were starting to put together another trip. They were looking to go to Lake Gardner in South Australia for a while, but that was not as smooth as Lake Eyre, and there was a bit of concern about that. But anyway, they were getting ready to do that because they were getting sick of waiting for Lake Eyre. And then over in the States, a couple of people went crazy, like Craig Breedlove, and set a new record of 754 kilometres an hour and jumped the record up substantially. And then Art Arpons went out there and jacked it up again. And so they sort of got smart then, and they decided that the speeds were then getting crazy, and you needed bigger jet engines and a lot more money behind them to do it, so they gave that one away. But so then he thought, well, we've learned a bit about jet engines, and they're a bit of fun. So the truck land speed record hasn't been broken for some while. It had been sitting there for a long time. So he went over to Tasmania. He owned a business called Recar Industries, which made fiberglass truck cabins for Kenworth and various other organisations. That's what his business was, as well as the marina. And so he nicked over to Tasmania and bought a junker log truck that was worn out, a Ford Louisville. And they brought it back, and they put the jet engine on the back of the chassis rail straight onto the Louisville. And the jet engine they used for that was a much bigger one, which was out of a RAF Meteor jet. And the engine had been given to the apprentices at CAC in Port Melbourne to work on to hone their skills. But anyway, somehow they managed to talk the CAC people into lending them the engine. So they whacked it on this truck. And the ones about our age can probably remember when they used to run it at drag strips and things like that. It used to be on TV all the time. They ran it on for displays up and down Calder drag strip and Sandown and things like that when the car races were on at the interval, because it used to send flames for about 50 metres out the back. So then they decided they'd have a crack at the world truck land speed record. So they took it up to Witchproof, and on a closed public road set a top speed of 176.2 miles an hour. And in fact, for a short burst, cracked 200 miles an hour, but that didn't rate they're only their average speed of 176 miles an hour rated as the record, and that record still stands. Okay, next slide. So the next stage down there, we've moved off the Strand now and we've moved down to Nelson Place. And Nelson Place in Williamstown is a very interesting place. It's a very old town. It's one of the oldest towns in Victoria. After Melbourne, it was the next oldest settlement around the whole Port Phillip region. There was a couple of down at settlements further along the coast at Portland and around there from sealers and various people that landed there, and settlers had moved down to those areas. But it was virtually after Melbourne, the next big town just out of Melbourne. And if you walk along there, there's still it's got a historic heritage order over most of the street, and you'll pass the old Prince of Wales Hotel, and that was regarded as being the last drinks pub for the sailors going out there at the time. And there's a lot of old bank buildings there. There's the old post office is the oldest left in Australia. The Commonwealth Reserve, there's the old tide gauge, and there was the anchor for the Nelson, the first warship of the Victorian Navy. And it's a very, very interesting streetscape, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. Next one, please. Okay, along there, of course, is Blunt's Boat Shed, and you can go in there and have a bit of a talk to Greg if he's feeling amenable, and he'll talk your ear off for hours about boats and boat building and wooden boats and that sort of thing. As far as I know, he's retired, sort of. He still seems to be there every day, but I don't think he's building boats from scratch anymore. He might be doing a bit of repair work, but that's about all, I think. But his 5 generations of Blunts have been building boats down there in Williamstown. They started off in Geelong and moved up the coast. The Ann Street Pier and the Castlemaine. The Castlemaine, we've got people in this room who know more about the Castlemaine than I do, a lot more. But she served with distinction in the coastal trade. She's hanging around Williamstown, has been as a bit of an icon of Williamstown now. And of course was built at the dockyards only 100 metres from where she sits today. She was a training vessel after serving in the Pacific and the South China Sea. She was a training vessel at HMAS Cerberus until the 70s, and then was moved up here and restored as a floating museum, and currently berthed at Gem Pier. And it's the marine icon of Williamstown, and if you want to know more about it, where is he? He's hiding up the back there. He can tell you more about it than anybody can. Next one, please. Wright's Patent Slip. Now, down at what's now the Seaworks, at the back there's a big slipway. And back in the day, that was one of the first slipways worldwide was built down there. And they were called marine railways, or Wright's, or patent slips. Now, Wright was the guy who built it and owned it, but the patent slip was developed by a Scot, Thomas Morton, in 1818, and it revolutionised repairing vessels. And up until then, they'd hauled them out onto the hard with great difficulty at high tide and let the tide bring them in, and then they'd work like mad on them at low tide to scrape the bottom and anti-foul them and that sort of thing. And the tide would come in and they'd all have to stop work and go back 12 hours later and do the same thing again, and so on. But the idea of the patent slip was you'd have a steam engine or a winch and you hauled the boat up a railway line on a railway carriage. Sounds simple today because we've all seen slipways all around the world, but it was radical and somebody had to invent it first, and Mr. Thomas Morton did it. But his patent ran out after 15 years, and not very many of them had been built. But then the government in the UK decided that the Commonwealth, for them to project their naval power around the world, they needed to be able to anti-foul ships when they were in Australia and when they were in South Africa and all of those places around the world that were part of colonial England. So they tried to establish these around the world and asked the colonial government here to put one together. And Mr. Robert Wright had predicted this, or got the inside running, and had bought the equipment out and had it sitting in a hulk at Williamstown, ready to rock and roll as soon as the Parliament decided that they were going to spend the money on a patent slip and called for tenders. And funnily enough, he was able to outbid anybody because he had it all there ready to rock and roll. He already owned it. It was already here in Australia. And funnily enough, it was going to take anybody else at least another 6 months to get one if they bought it out from the UK. And that's after they had the steam engines built and everything. So you had the inside running, I think is the polite way of putting it. And Mr. Wright built his patent slip at Williamstown. And then it had an interesting history thereafter. We'll move to the next slide. By the way, the foundations for this are still, you can still be seen at low tide at Williamstown. The Civil War in the 1850s was going on in the US, and there was a ship called the Shenandoah, which was a very fast, well-built warship. And it was the Confederate Army's ship, the only really ship of substance. It wasn't the only substance, only ship in the Confederate Navy, because they later on got a monitor as well. But it was the main raider that was sent around the world to wreak havoc in the shipping of the Union states, and hopefully cost them a lot of money, and they would take the pressure off the southern states. And it sank quite a few Union ships in the Indian Ocean, and then had been out at sea for a long time, and had lost a few crew members, and needed anti-fouling, and needed to be a lot of other work on it. And it rocked up to Melbourne, and very, very controversially, the crew, all southern gentlemen, were mixing very happily with the young ladies of Melbourne, and attended lots of social events and dances, and were very popular with the Toorak set, as it was, well, maybe it wasn't Toorak then, but that kind of group. And they managed to convince the Victorian government that they would haul it up on Wright's patent slip, which it was. Then the US consul at the time was campaigning to have it arrested while it was on the slip. And for about 2 weeks it was arrested on the slip. Then the supporters of the Confederates managed to convince the Victorian government to lift that ban, which they did. And they did restore the vessel. And when I say restore it, I'm using restore it in the old word, in other words, adding stores to it. And they anti-fouled it, and they quite a few crew members joined from the colony. So quite a few Victorians fought for the Confederates in the Civil War, which is rather interesting. The Shenandoah then left Melbourne and went on to sink another 25 Union merchant ships. It was very, very successful at sinking merchant ships. And by the time the war was over and the South had been defeated, Britain was in big trouble with the American government, because a vessel, remember we were still a colony then, and one of their vessels effectively one of the Confederate vessels had been resupplied and everything in Melbourne, and they claimed huge war reparations off the British government for the 25 ships that were sank. And the British government, not the Victorian government, was found by international law to have breached agreements between the US and the UK and paid substantial reparations to the US government. Next slide. Okay, Ann Street Pier. The next one along is the Ann Street Pier. It's a very old pier as well. It was built well before Victoria Dock, and it's probably been, they're like grandfather's axe, these jetties. They're built and rebuilt, and bits that rot away get replaced and so on. But the jetty that's there now is on the same location and generally the same construction as the original. The Ann Street Pier was had a bit of a checkered career. It was used for ballasting. It was actually the jetty that was used for ballasting the ships. The ships would pull into Ann Street, and they would go alongside that jetty, that pier, I should say, to have their ballast put in. And they had rail trucks that used to run out onto it from a siding and off the railway line to Williamstown. down the bottom there's a quote out of one of the early newspapers in 1864, just saying that the barkentine was hauled alongside from Railway Pier to the Williamstown Pier to Ann Street Pier to be ballasted. Next slide. In Ann Street, just in the back of, and I think probably most of you are aware of this, there's an old building called the Mortuary Building. That's what it used to look like in its intermediate years. It actually, when it was first built, had 2 windows. It now has 2 windows again, they're boarded up. But it's been moved twice. It was originally down the water's edge in what's now the park near the main public pier at Williamstown there, Gem Pier. And from there it was dismantled and moved. The reason they built it right on the water's edge is at high tide, the water would come in and slosh through the floor and wash the floor out. So all the blood and guts would go out into the bay. And they built it because they had a lot of deaths around that time on ships coming into Australia with typhus, with typhoid, with all kinds of illnesses, and they wouldn't allow them to land. And we all know about the quarantine station, which was built later on to handle this problem. But in the early days, they would just put them on the hulks that were floating around off Williamstown, which were later used as prison hulks, or around the same era were being used as prison hulks. And when they died, they'd be brought ashore and chopped up here, and then buried after the coroner had worked out what had killed them. So that was why we had the mortuary there. It was the first mortuary in Victoria, and they later on built a much larger one down near where Princess Bridge Station was now. Okay, next one please. Right, not far from there, we couldn't see it when we did our road version of this, but because it's inside the dockyards, which are now locked up, but it is the Alfred Graving Dock. Now this was a massive construction this was to replace the patent slip really when ships got too big to be hauled out on the patent slip. And the British government wanted somewhere in this part of the world that they could repair warships, or any ships for that matter. But so they built this large graving dock. Now, a graving dock, as I understand it, the difference between a dry dock and a graving dock is that the graving dock's built into the ground, and a dry dock is not necessarily built into the ground. Now, they float the ship in. You can see the keel blocks at the bottom there of the photograph. They open the doors, they float the ship in, they close the doors open outwards as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but they open outwards and the water pressure holds them together when they're shut and when the dock is empty. And then they pump the water out of the dock. And they have to, of course, prop the ship. You can see how it's propped over to either side, and this is a very skilled bit of shipwrighting work to get the ships propped properly so it's not going to tip over and fall over, and it's centred on the blocks and things. It's not an easy task to move a ship into a dry dock like that and set it up properly. The dock's interesting because I remember having a discussion with one of the gentlemen in the club here about how it was made out of bluestone. And he said, no, it's timber. So then I did a bit more research on it. It's actually lined with bluestone and then it's lined with timber inside the bluestone. And there's old drawings of it that are bluestone. Then there's other ones that show it with timber lining in it. And the next photo you'll see the timber lining in it. This one it's a bit hard to tell whether it's timber or bluestone. I think on this one it's bluestone and it's stepped. On the other ones it's not stepped with the timber inside. But it's the reason they lined it with timber later on is they were using it as a dock and they were mooring ships in there when it was flooded, particularly naval vessels and things like that. They were actually using it to moor ships here when it wasn't being, but they were being serviced, but the hull wasn't being repainted. And so it was much easier on the hulls to have a wooden lining in them, and it was much easier for props and things too because they didn't slip as much as they would on the bluestone and stuff at the time. So it's actually part of both. It's been owned by various people. It was owned by the state government initially because when it was a colony, then it was became part of the Navy. Then it went to the Commonwealth Government in 1918, then it passed to the Harbour Trust, and then back to the Commonwealth Government in 1942, and from since then has been part of the Williamstown Dockyard, Naval Dockyard, which is currently privately owned, but currently being unused since I think the Yarra class boats, or was it the Anzac class ones they picked? Were the last boats built there? Do you remember that? Was it the Anzacs? Yeah. So it was sort of being used as a construction dockyard up until 1980s, would it be? 80s or 90s? 90s, I think.
The largest ships in the Navy had Canberra and Adelaide.
Yeah.
They were finished there.
Yeah, that's right.
The hulls were...
They were built in sections, weren't they? The hulls and put together there, weren't they?
The hulls were brought from Spain.
Yeah, oh, that's right, yeah. But did they use the graving dock at all then? I don't think they did they? They did them on the wharf down a bit further, I think, didn't they? When they assembled those vessels and the interiors and everything were done and all the decking and stuff, was that done in the graving dock, or was it done alongside the jetties further down? Do you remember? No, that's what I thought. Yeah. So it hasn't been used significantly for a number of years, and I don't think it's from what I've been told, there aren't very many people around capable of operating it anymore anyway. There's a few retired people from the Navy and the dockyards and people like that who may know how to use it, but not many. Okay, the next one, please. Right, you can see how it's been lined in wood there, and it's a little bit different. That's actually a photograph where the other one was an etching. But so it's really the same story as the previous one, so we can move on from that one.
What's the derivation of the name graving?
Well, one of them's dug into the ground, right, like a grave, right? And the other one, a dry dock can lift the ship out of the water. Sometimes they pump, well, some of them, they sink the pontoons down, run the ship in, then pump it out and the pontoons raise up and raise the ship out of the water. And they're dry docks, but and the other was a graving dock. I think that's the definition of the difference. The graving docks are actually built into the ground. Right, well, the next thing we want to talk about is the Victorian Navy. Now, people don't realise these days that we had a navy when the colonies all got together in 1901. Only one state had a navy of any consequence. They had one in New South Wales, but only had 2 vessels, and they weren't very big ones. But the Victorians had, because Victoria was the wealthiest state back in those days because of the gold rushes, and so they had a navy. And one of the big vessels that they ordered was the Cerberus, which was the type of ship called a monitor that came to fame in the American Civil War. But they were low to the water, built with very heavy steel-plated hulls, big guns on them, and were hard to hit because they were lower in the water. And they weren't very good boats at sea, but they were capable of ocean passages. And they were pretty slow too, because they were steam engines, and they weren't auxiliary steam engines, they were steam engine driven. And the colonial government decided it needed a navy to protect Victoria because we were such a wealthy town. They were worried about, there was various groups, the Russians and various others, because the Brits were fighting the Russians with the Crimean War, and these sort of things were going on in the world, and they were worried that they had to protect Melbourne. So they decided they needed a navy. Now, the navy was based at Williamstown, and a lot of the sailors came from the area because there were a lot of seagoing men, and so they had a shortage, of course, of money and people. So they rounded up, they made a naval reserve, and the naval reserve consisted of many locals that were miners in the basalt mines and other workers from around the Williamstown area and stevedores and that sort of thing, joined the naval reserve. and they were paid an amount of money to go along to the meeting, just like the reserves were later on not terribly much money, but some money, and given a uniform and given training in loading guns and operating vessels and so on. So it was a good way for younger people to get a trade and learn skills that they didn't have before. While there wasn't a war, it all seemed like good fun. Okay, next one, please. Right. By the time we came around to getting together as a country in 1901 and consolidating all the states, the Victorian Navy was quite large, and there's a couple of significant vessels there, and I'll just point them out on the slide. This one here was the Monitor, the Cerberus that we talked about. The one behind it is an auxiliary steam battleship of the old type, which is the Nelson, and this one down here is the Cirrus. And this is a particularly interesting boat because this was a state-of-the-art vessel at the time, and this one was too, to a degree, but this was a forerunner of modern destroyers. And very soon after that, they built another lot of destroyers, the Roebuck class, which were very similar. They had a barrel deck at the front. They were absolute bastards of things to sail on. They rolled like mad, they pitched, and the waves broke over them all the time. They were a very wet boat. And the worst job in the Navy was to be a stoker on one of those things because they would do 30 knots. They were very fast for boats of the era. And the amount of coal they went through to maintain a speed of that type of nature in choppy seas was enormous. So some poor bastard was down there shoveling the stuff because they didn't have mechanical feeders and stuff like that. They were literally shoveling the stuff into the boilers, standing down there as hot as hell, with the thing throwing itself all over the ocean. They must have been knee-deep in chunder, I think, down there, because it would have been a terrible job. And that's what they did. And those vessels, they brought out a second version of them, which came out in about 1898. This is the next version of it came out, which were even faster still. These would do about 20 knots, and the ones that came out in 1898 would do 30 knots. You could have water skied behind them. And then from there on, they started to put if we move to the next slide, that's just a list of the vessels on that painting, which is quite a famous painting that was done of the Navy at the time, and that lists the vessels and what their names are. So we'll go to the next one. Okay, this is the next iteration of the destroyers, and you can see the barrel deck has gone from the front, and they've got a higher bow, so they won't go through the waves. They'll lift to the waves much more than the early. They're still actually pretty much the same design, except for the shape of the bow. And again, they were fast and small, and they're actually moored tied up there in the graving dock at Williamstown. And so you can see that they're quite small vessels because two of them side by side had a lot of space around them. And if you look at the size of the men on the bow, they weren't big boats, but they were terrible sea boats because they were so bloody narrow and rolled like pigs. Right. Now, the interesting thing is at the beginning of World War I, which is shortly after this, around this era, of course we went into World War I, and everybody held up their hands to help. It was one of those things that there was a great rush to help the Brits, and a lot of the people from Footscray, the reservists, were rounded up and became, of course, full-time Navy men. And off they went to war. And because these ships were pretty old, and some of them were fairly new like that type, but they were small, and they got knocked off pretty heavily in the early parts of the war, and the casualties from that Footscray and Yarraville area were very high. And quite a few of the Williamstown area was sort of decimated with the sons of the families going off to war, not only in the Navy, but the war in general, and it was hit pretty hard, that area. Next one. Okay, the next thing along, you go a bit further along the Strand and you get out to Point Gellibrand. Now, sitting out at Point Gellibrand, there's a number of things. The first and most obvious one when you roll up is the Time Ball Tower. Now, the Time Ball Tower was built because it was built originally as a lighthouse, and it was a long way in from the reef. The reef sticks out quite a long way at Point Gellibrand, out several hundred metres out, and people were still running a bit too close to the cliffs and ignoring the lighthouse largely. You know, they could say, yeah, there's the land, but they didn't realise that the reefs went out past there. And of course, these are sailing ships coming in from all over the world, and they were not necessarily very well equipped with charts and things like that, or navigators. So after a while, they decided they'd have to move the lighthouse. So they moved the lighthouse, and they put a floating buoy out on the edge of the reef. Or they actually built a small tower on the edge of the reef, and they had a buoy out there as well with a light on it. And so they moved the lighthouse to the outer edge of the reef, which was good. Then they decided they'd use the tower as a time ball tower. Now, what the time ball is used for those in the room here that know anything about celestial navigation, it requires an accurate clock, because your clock tells you the longitude you're at, where you are around the world by the sun and the time, and with the correct tables you can work out what your longitude is if you've got Greenwich Mean Time on a clock, and that clock is accurate. So you had to have an accurate clock, and you had to reset it. The Time Ball Tower had two things it did. The first thing was they would drop the ball at 1:30, 1 o'clock I think it was, every day, not 12 but 1. And they'd drop the ball down the tower. When it hit the bottom was exactly 1 o'clock. And so you could reset your chronometer for 1 o'clock. But you also, before you reset it, you took a note of how far out it was when you reset it. And then you knew from the time you left Greenwich and you'd set it as you were sailing down the Thames, that it was losing 1 second a day or whatever it was, because it was now 4 minutes out when you were in Melbourne, or 5 minutes or whatever it was. And so you would then, not only did you reset your clock to 0 again, to Greenwich Mean Time, but you then also would set it, would know the table that you had to apply each day, the correction that you had to apply each day. So that was part of it. Then the second thing was that when you, with your sextant, when you're taking sun sights and things, again, to get the correct information off your tables, you had to know when the time was right to take the sights. So it had a dual effect, but so it was really important piece of equipment for them to have out in the colony. Originally they did this they were doing it at the Botanic Gardens at the observatory, but then of course people would have to go in there, the navigators set their clock in the observatory, then go back to the ship, and there's a lot of stuffing around. So then they decided to move it out to this when they moved the light out of the tower. And it's been there since 1853, that's right. So it's been out there. It's no longer used because they use electronic time signals now. Okay, next one please. Oh, that's a little bit about the celestial navigation and sight reduction tables you use and how you do it. I'm not going to go into that tonight because it's too complicated. If anybody wants to copy the slides, then we can do that and they can have a bit of a look at it. Or they can talk to me. I did do a course in celestial navigation and got a certificate in it, but I think it was in about 1970, and I may have forgotten a bit of it since then because I haven't used it since about 1973. It was interesting when we did the course. It was done by RMIT at the time, and it was part of their seamanship courses that they were teaching, and they did the lectures down here at Kerford Road at the Victoria Hotel, because you could get a sunset there. That we would sit in the front bar of the Victoria Hotel in the veranda with our sextants taking sights of the sunset, exactly. And of course you had a beer sitting on the table over there. It was a very civilised way of learning how to celestial navigation. Okay, next slide. All right, now our lighthouse they finally replaced the lighthouse out on the end of Point Jellybrand with a pile light, which is on the left there. And that pile light was built around 1905, and for the next nearly a century, not quite a century, but nearly a century, or the next 70 odd years anyway, it not only did it guide the boats coming into the Yarra River and Williamstown and the Port of Melbourne, it also had a family of the lighthouse keeper, his wife and his 3 kids lived on it. And the kids every day would go by boat over to Williamstown to the pier and get off and go to school. And then they'd go the same thing back again. They'd be rowed out, picked up by Dad or one of the lighthouse keepers or whatever, and rowed back out. And they lived on that. And they were still living on that in the 1980s, and the pile light, 1970s it was. I can remember taking my boat around it in the 70s and sort of waving to people there and the washing hanging out from the line and all that sort of stuff. It got hit by a ship. He wasn't terribly good at steering. To hit the lighthouse is not good navigation. And almost within 24 hours or so, the Lighthouse Association made a decision to burn it down because they were worried that somebody was going to put a heritage order on it and want it restored, and they didn't have the money and they didn't really want to do it because the maintenance was too high and they'd been wondering how to get rid of it and all the rest of it. So they set it on fire before anybody could say, oh, it's heritage protected, we've got to do this, this and this. They jumped the gun and they thought, well, it's going to cost too much to fix, so they burnt it. And that was the light, the actual dome light from the top is now sitting in Seaworks, I believe, in the corner there. And the last time I saw it was in Seaworks. They removed that before I think it was after the fire. As you can see, the fire's burning there, it's still there at that time. So I presume they salvaged it when the fire went out. And the fire didn't burn the whole lot, it was still sitting on an angle for quite a while, and then they ended up yanking the rest of it down. You just used another vessel and pulled the bloody thing apart. Next one, please. Okay, round the corner there, in that same area at Port Jellybrand, is Williamstown Fort. If you look carefully, you can see 3 gun stations here, still with the old cannons in them, there and there. And the fort is still used as a military base. Obviously the cannons are no longer used, but the fort's still used as a military base, and it's actually the headquarters of the local commando company in Melbourne. And they're based there, and they do exercises of canoeing and stuff like that out from there. And it's a CMF unit, a reserves unit, or it used to be CMF, but now Army Reserves Unit. The commandos, and they have a long history going back to World War II, and they were involved in some very famous raids on Singapore and various other places around the Pacific. And but that was their base, and their training area. The main training area used was at Wilson's Promontory. Right. Port Jellybrand is still part of the defence system for Australia. The next thing, the interesting point, you go around that peninsula a little bit further, is the old Williamstown Rifle Range. And the rifle range was started a bit further around to the area that's now Williamstown Beach, not far from where the Lifesaving Club is. But then they found it was a bit of a problem because people wanted to swim there and they were shooting. And it's sort of, shooting people swimming in the water is not really a good idea. They don't mix very well. So they moved it around the corner, and the Rifle Range Hotel is still there on the corner near the railway line, where it used to be the nearest corner to Williamstown of the new Rifle Range, as they call it, which was also the site for the Olympic Games rifle shooting. In the Olympics were in Melbourne. All the pistol shooting and rifle shooting sports were held out at that rifle range, and it was renamed the Merritt Range then after Colonel Merritt, who was on the board of the Victorian Rifle Association. So, but everybody still called it the Williamstown Rifle Range. When I was in the army, nobody ever called it the Merritt Range. You wouldn't have known what we were talking about. And I remember going out there as a 15-year-old school cadet and being given a Bren gun to use. There were different times. But there we were with the breeding gun all lined up, and this seagull the targets were all lined there, and we're supposed to be shooting at the targets. And this seagull just happened to land on top of the butts, just above the target. The seagull didn't last very long. And that was sort of the way things were a little bit back then. But can you imagine today them busing kids, 15-year-old kids out from schools, giving them a Bren gun, and which is a machine gun and two tripod thing, on a bipod thing at the front, lying down on the ground and blasting bullets crazily around targets. Okay, when they finally decided to make it into a housing estate, they had to restore the land, and the army, when they first established it, had guaranteed that they would restore it, and so they paid for it to be restored. And they mined the lead, and it was reported to be the richest lead mine in Australia, because it has spent nearly 100 years with people shooting at it regularly. And all soldiers in World War II and in the Vietnam War all used it with training. School cadets did, the military reserves did. When I joined the military reserves in the 1970s, I went down there and did my training again, and we still had the same bloody Bren guns, although they were just about were about to be replaced then, and they were replaced while I was in the military. But it became quite a well-known thing in Melbourne. Lots of rifle clubs operated down there as well. In the background there, you can see some buildings along there. They're the old racecourse buildings, and we'll come to that next. We did discuss, go to the next slide if we can. Okay, not quite there yet. This is the boat sheds at the mouth of Koroit Creek. This is a very weird little place that, when I took some people down on the road version of the Urban Explorer, a woman who'd lived in Williamstown all her life did not know this place existed. It's the mouth of Koroit Creek. There are about 20, maybe 30 boat sheds along there. They've got TV antennas, they've got power cord to them, they've got locked up doors and windows with curtains on them, and it's a little village. It's totally and utterly illegal. They're not supposed to be living in them, but they do. And they've been living in them since the 1930s. They've been there in the 1920s actually. And they've all got their own little jetties, and there is a channel at high tide. You can get in and out of Koroit Creek in a small boat. And down the end, behind where this photo is taken from, there's one house that's really a house. It's not a very big house, but that was owned by a fisherman called Phil McAdam, who was there up until 6 months or so ago. He was still operating there, certainly within the last year. And he had one of the last net licences in Port Phillip Bay, which have now gone. And he used to sell bait there. He used to go out after the whitebait, and he would sell bait from that building, and his family have been doing it for the last 50 or 60 years. And I think that'll probably die. He's got about half a dozen boats down there, some are wooden. There's quite a lot of wooden boats down, just sitting there under trees and things down along there. There's two fishing clubs that operate down there. The Brunswick Fishing Club is one of them. I can't remember who the other one is. And there's maybe a dozen old wooden fishing boats down there as part of that group. It's well worth going down and having a look at it. You can walk down there. It's at the end of what's it called? I think I put it up there somewhere in the Maddox Road. Yeah, it's at the end of Maddox Road, and when you're driving along Koroit Creek Road, you can see a little turn off. There's traffic lights there because Maddox Road going north is quite a busy road, and there's a football ground on the south, and this is between the football ground and the creek down the back. It's worth having a drive down there because it's just an intriguing spot. And the bird life down there is amazing, because over the other side now is part of the whole wetlands reserves on the western side of the bay, because now when you take the Western Treatment Plant into account as well, it's virtually the whole of the bay except for the area around Point Cook and Werribee, not so much even Werribee, because Werribee's inland a bit, but around Point Cook in that area, and Altona. The rest of the western part of the bay, right down almost to Geelong, certainly to Avalon, is all reserved now at one form or another. And the bird life down there is amazing, absolutely amazing. Okay, next slide. Now, when you go down Croy Creek Road, there's a road called Racecourse Road that runs down to Altona. And it goes across the last ford left in the suburban area in Melbourne, across Croy Creek. And when you go across that ford, just to the left, as you're heading south, just to the left, you'll see rapids and things, and it's an incredible little bird sanctuary just right there. And yet trains go past 25 metres or 30 metres away. There's the railway line down to that runs down to Altona, goes past the site. There's factories on the other side you can see in the distance, and then all this beautiful bird life is on the river there. And that river was once the most polluted waterway in Australia. In the 1970s, it was listed as the most polluted waterway in Australia. And then they brought in the EPA. The EPA came in around 1972. And I remember it well because I was working in the dye house industry then. And everybody was running for cover like you would not believe. All of a sudden, drains were being put in, traps were being put in, and pumps were being put in and everything, because we knew within about 6 months' time we were going to get an inspection. If we hadn't cleaned it up by then, we were in deep stuff. And but within 5 years or so of the EPA being created, both the Yarra and Croy Creek started to become cleaner again. The worst they were was in the early 1970s. I used to swim in the river all the time at Ivanhoe, because we lived on the river at Ivanhoe. And after school we'd go down there to swim in summer. And up until about 1970, you could swim in, or late 60, 68, 69, you could swim in the river perfectly well. You come out, you feel healthy and all. Then almost overnight it got to the stage where the river got overloaded and you come out and your eyes would be red and sore, and you get an ear infection, something like that. And we all stopped swimming in the river. And then, but when the EPA came in, that was sort of the worst situation. There were still tanneries operating in Collingwood in those days on the river, and I mean that was downstream from where we were, but upstream it was all the septic tanks in Templestowe and Lower Templestowe, Health, and those areas that were emptying into the river that was the problem. So anyway, they cleaned up Croy Creek. It's fantastic now, and it's an interesting spot to go and have a little bit of a look at the birds. And also, let's move to the next slide. Now, when we had the last one here, somebody mentioned the racecourse, and I put a couple of slides on the end. I didn't have those in most of the people that saw the original version of Urban Explorer. So I have put them into this one, not so much for the group that's here, but for the others that are going to be seeing this talk and having it. For those that weren't last time here, the Williamstown Racecourse used to be the second biggest racecourse in Melbourne after Flemington. It was bigger than Field and bigger than Valley. If we'd like to move to the next slide. It had its own railway stations, and there it is. It was like that up until World War II. World War II, they took it over as a military camp and used the land and the grandstands and things for the army. And at the end of the war, they never really got around. They were supposed to be refurbishing it all and all of that sort of stuff, and it never happened. And squatters got into it and set it on fire. And although you could see the grandstand still from the Williamstown Rifle Range when I was down there in the 1970s, it had been burnt out by then. The ford I'm talking about is down in the foreground. Here on the slide you can see it where it crosses Croy Creek. Now, of course, that's all reserve, and on this side of Croy Creek the railway line runs along, which was there back in the day of the racecourse. And the railway line the racecourse had its own railway station, because of course it was before cars and that sort of thing that the racecourse was originally built. Okay, next one. There's the gold grandstand, and talks about the fire. 1948, the actual fire went through it, but it was still, quite a lot of it was still standing after they put the fire out, but they never restored it after the fire. Next, please. You can just see there where the area that the racecourse was in and where it was located, and that's now a reserve, and it's sort of joined on to the Ramsar Reserve, so it's sports grounds and stuff like that, but it's gradually a lot of reforestation's going on down there, and the scrub is coming back, covering quite a lot of that area. And it's part of that fantastic migratory bird habitat that stretches from there to Avalon down the side of the bay. Right. And this is something I just threw in there for a bit of porn for wooden boat nuts. And that boat is made of Huon pine. The whole bloody thing is made of Huon pine. There's a bit of King Billy in it, but most of it's Huon. And how he got that much of Huon together to build the whole bloody boat, I don't know. But he did, and it must have cost him an absolute arm and a leg. It was down at the Geelong Wooden Boat Show in 2020, just before the shutdown. And yeah. Okay, and that's all I've got to say. There is another one that's being prepared at the moment for a different part of Melbourne, which we'll have next year if the club wants to have it next year. Otherwise, I'll put it together for other organisations that also use it. So that's all for tonight, guys. Any questions?